He very much knows what's happening, and he is a very capable guy. And after this, President Trump then mentions Mr. Giuliani twice more in that call. Now, from Mr. Giuliani, by this point, you understood that in order to get that White House meeting that you wanted President Zelensky to have, and that President Zelensky desperately wanted to have, that Ukraine would have to initiate these two investigations. Is that right?
Well, they would have to announce that they were going to do it.
Right, because Giuliani and President Trump didn't actually care if they did them, right?
I never heard, Mr. Goldman, anyone say that the investigations had to start or had to be completed. The only thing I heard from Mr. Giuliani or otherwise was that they had to be announced in some form, and that form kept changing.
Announced publicly?
Announced publicly.
And you, of course, recognize that there would be political benefits to a public announcement as opposed to a private confirmation, right?
Well, the way it was expressed to me was that the Ukrainians had a long history of committing to things privately and then never following through. So President Trump presumably, again, communicated through Mr. Giuliani, wanted the Ukrainians on record publicly that they were going to do these investigations. That's the reason that was given to me.
But you never heard anyone say that they really wanted them to do the investigations, just that they wanted to announce them.
I didn't hear either way.
Now, your July 26th call with the president was not the only time that you spoke to the president surrounding that Ukraine trip, was it?
I believe I spoke to him before his call.
And that would be on July 25th, the day before.
Yeah, I think I was flying to Ukraine, and I spoke with him, if I recall correctly, just before I got on the plane.
So that's 2 private telephone calls with President Trump in the span of 2 days. Is that right?
Correct.
You had direct access then to President Trump, correct?
I had occasional access when he chose to take my call. Sometimes he would, sometimes he wouldn't.
Well, he certainly took your call twice as it related to Ukraine on these 2 days. Is that right?
He did.
Now, the morning of July 25th, you texted Ambassador Volker, and we could bring up the next text exchange, at 7:54 a.m., and you said, call ASAP. Ambassador Volker did not respond to you for another hour and a half, and he said, hi, Gordon, got your message, had a great lunch with Yermak, and then passed your message to him. He will see you tomorrow. Think everything in place. Volker, though, an hour before that, and about a half an hour before the phone call, had texted Andrei Yermak, a top aide for President Zelensky. And he wrote, good lunch, thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. See you tomorrow. Ambassador Sondland, was this message that Kurt Volker passed to Andrei Yermak the message you left for Kurt Volker on that voicemail that he referenced?
You know, I don't remember, Mr. Goldman, but it very well could have been.
You don't have any reason to think it wasn't, right?
Again, I honestly don't remember, but seems logical to me.
And if Ambassador Volker testified that he did get that message from you, you have no reason to doubt that,
No, if he testified that he got that message from me, then I would concur with that.
So is it fair to say that this message is what you received from President Trump in that phone call that morning?
Again, if he testified to that, to refresh my own memory, then yes, likely I would have received that from President Trump.
But the sequence certainly makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does.
You talked to President Trump. You told Kurt Volker to call you. You left a message for Kurt Volker. Kurt Volker sent this text message to Andrei Yermak to prepare President Zelensky. And then President Trump had a phone call where President Zelensky spoke very similar to what was in this text message, right?
Right.
And you would agree that the message in this that is expressed here is that President Zelensky needs to convince Trump that he will do the investigations in order to nail down the date for a visit to Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, I'm going to move ahead in time to the end of August and early September when you came to believe, I believe, as you testified, that it wasn't just the White House meeting that was contingent on the announcement of these investigations that the president wanted, but security assistance as well. You testified that in the absence of any credible explanation for the hold on security assistance, you came to the conclusion that, like the White House visit, the aid was conditioned on the investigations that President Trump wanted. Is that what you said in your opening statement?
It is.
So let me break this down with you. By this time, you and many top officials knew that that coveted White House meeting for President Zelensky was conditioned on these investigations, right?
The announcement of the investigations, correct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that includes Secretary Pompeo, right?
Many people.
And, well, Secretary Pompeo?
Yes.
And Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney?
Yes.
And you testified that this was a quid pro quo. Is that right?
I did.
And you, at this point, by the end of August, knew that the aid had been held up for at least 6 weeks. Is that correct?
I believe I found out through Ambassador Taylor that the aid had been held up around July 18th is when I heard originally.
And even though you searched for reasons, you were never given a credible explanation. Is that right?
That's right.
And no one you spoke to thought that the aid should be held, to your knowledge. Is that right?
I never heard anyone advocate for holding the aid.
And now, by this point, at the end of August, it went public and the Ukrainians knew about it, right?
I believe there was some press reports, presuming or who knows, but I think at that point it became sort of common knowledge that everything might be tied together.
And in fact, President Zelensky brought it up at that September 1st meeting with Vice President Pence that you were at, right?
I don't know if he brought it up specifically, but asked where the aid was, I think he sort of asked, again, very vague recollection, because I don't have a readout of the bilateral meeting, but why don't I have my check, essentially?
And you understood the Ukrainians received no credible explanation. Is that right?
I certainly couldn't give them one.
So is this kind of a 2 + 2 = 4 conclusion that you reached?
Pretty much.
Is the only logical conclusion to you that, given all of these factors, that the aid was also a part of this quid pro quo?
Yep.
Now, I want to go back to that conversation that you had with Vice President Pence right before that meeting in Warsaw. And you indicated that you said to him that you were concerned that the delay in the aid was tied to the issue of investigations. Is that right?
I don't know exactly what I said to him. This was a briefing attended by many people, and I was invited at the very last minute. I wasn't scheduled to be there. But I think I spoke up at some point late in the meeting and said, it looks like everything is being held up until these statements get made, and that's my, personal belief.
And Vice President Pence just nodded his head?
I don't recall any exchange or where he asked me any questions. I think it was sort of a duly noted.
Well, he didn't say, Gordon, what are you talking about?
No, he did not.
He didn't say, what investigations?
He did not.
Now, after this meeting, you discussed this pull-aside you had with Mr. Yermak, where you relayed your belief that they needed to announce these investigations prior to the aid being released. Is that right?
I said I didn't know exactly why, but this could be a reason.
And obviously you had been speaking with Mr. Yermak for quite a while about a public announcement of these investigations, right?
We had all been working toward that end, yes.
And so you indicated to him that in addition to the White House meeting, security aid was now also involved in that.
As I said it could have been involved, yes.
Now, I'm going to show you another text exchange you had on September 1st, where Ambassador Taylor says to you, are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations? And you respond, call me. Ambassador Taylor recalls that he did call you, and you did have a conversation. And in that conversation, you told Ambassador Taylor that the announcement of these investigations by President Zelensky needed to be public, and that announcement was conditioned on that announcement would ultimately release the aid. Do you recall that conversation with Ambassador Taylor?
Again, my conversation with Ambassador Taylor, my conversation with Senator Johnson were all my personal belief, just based on, as you put it, 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, in his testimony, Ambassador Taylor says that you said that President Trump had told you that he wanted President Zelensky to state publicly as of September 1st. Do you have any reason to doubt Ambassador Taylor's testimony, which he said was based on his meticulous contemporaneous notes?
President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the meetings. The only thing we got directly from Giuliani was that the Burisma and 2016 elections were conditioned on the White House meeting. The aid was my own personal, guess, based again on your analogy, 2 + 2 = 4.
So you didn't talk to President Trump when Ambassador Taylor says that that's what you told him? Is that your testimony here?
My testimony is I never heard from President Trump that aid was conditioned on an announcement of elections.
So you never heard those specific words?
Correct.
Right? But
never heard those words.
And well, let's move ahead because you have another conversation in a little bit later that both Tim Morrison and Ambassador Taylor recount. But in this September 1st conversation, Ambassador Taylor also testified under oath that you said that President Trump wanted Zelensky in a public box. Do you recall using that expression?
Yeah, it goes back to my earlier comment that, again, coming from the Giuliani source, because we didn't discuss this specifically with President Trump, that they wanted whatever commitments Ukraine made to be made publicly so that they would be on the record and be held more accountable, whatever those commitments were.
You also testified, or Ambassador Taylor rather testified, that you told him that you had made a mistake in telling the Ukrainians that only the White House meeting was conditioned on the announcement of the investigations, and that in fact everything was, including the security assistance. Do you remember saying that?
When I referenced a mistake, what I recall was I thought that a statement made by the new Ukrainian prosecutor that these investigations would be started up again or commenced would be sufficient to satisfy Mr. Giuliani / President Trump. As I recall, my mistake was someone came back through Volker or otherwise and said, no, it's not going to do if the prosecutor makes these statements. The president wants to hear it from Zelensky directly. That's the mistake I think I made.
Do you have any reason to question Ambassador Taylor's testimony based on his meticulous and careful contemporaneous notes?
I'm not going to question or not question. I'm just telling you what I believe I was referring to.
Let me fast forward a week and show you another text exchange which may help refresh your recollection. On September 8th, you sent a text to Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Volker. Can you read what you wrote there?
Guys, multiple convos with Zelensky, POTUS, let's talk.
And so this was September 8th at 11:20 in the morning. Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Taylor responds immediately, now is fine with me. And if we could go to the next exchange. Ambassador Taylor then 15 minutes later says, Gordon and I just spoke, or 20 minutes later rather. I can brief you if you and Gordon don't connect, speaking to Ambassador Volker. Then Ambassador Taylor an hour later says, the nightmare is they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. The Russians love it, and I quit. You would agree that in this text message, after you had spoken an hour earlier with Ambassador Taylor, that he is linking the security assistance to this interview, this public announcement by President Zelensky. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And in fact, Ambassador Taylor testified that you did have a conversation with him at that point, and that you told him that, just as your text message indicates, you did have a conversation with President Trump prior to that text message. Does that help to refresh your recollection that you, in fact, spoke to President Trump at that time?
Again, I don't recall President Trump ever talking to me about any security assistance, ever. What this tells me, refreshing my memory, is that by the 8th of September, it was abundantly clear to everyone that there was a link and that we were discussing the chicken and egg issue of should the Ukrainians go out on a ledge